Thank you, Farouk. It's a great pleasure to join your Innovation Summit and to share my perspectives on innovation as a driver of competitive advantage. And I'm going to be speaking with a very big picture view, starting out with sort of the world economy, and I will gradually focus down on some of the corporate strategies which are necessary to drive competitive advantage. And of course, the world is going through a number of important transitions right now. Perhaps the most important over the last 30 or 40 years has been the shift from what you might call an industrial era to one built on digital technology. And we've all experienced that in our day-to-day lives. Just one piece of data to prove that this transition is affecting corporate advantage. I have on the slide behind you, you can see the top 10 companies in the world in terms of value, in terms of profits and revenues from 1980. And of course, it's a list dominated by industrial companies. It's dominated by car manufacturers. It's dominated by oil and gas companies. General Electric, of course, a diversified company in at number 5. And the same list today looks remarkably different. If I can make the clicker work. There we go. Today's list is, of course, dominated by digital companies. You can see Saudi Aramco in that list. So there is still an important role, of course, for oil and gas in the world today. But the rest of the companies essentially are digital companies. And 5 of these companies, 6 of them actually, are valued at more than $1 trillion. So that transition is underway. It is going to accelerate further. And it is worth just reflecting briefly on how this sort of shift happens in the context of the global economy. And I will just stay at the global level just for a second, because if you take a long-term view, if you take a 100-plus year view, this is a 200-year view, in fact, you can see, of course, that GDP, gross domestic product, which is a basic measure of economic productivity, economic success, has accelerated dramatically through this period of time. And we all understand, I think, that the Industrial Revolution was what drove that for the first period. And now we are entering what we can call the digital revolution period, and that's driving the next stage. Now, there's many factors that explain gross domestic product per capita. Natural resources, being a country built on good reserves of oil and gas, for example, is hugely important. Investment, capital investment is a driver. But the real driver that affects the way that countries evolve is what I want to call productivity. This is what economists measure in order to figure out which countries are being the most effective. And what is productivity? It's essentially just doing more with less. It's creating outputs with relatively few inputs. And how does productivity get achieved? Well, the answer, you will not be surprised to know, is innovation. Innovations in terms of the products and services that we use, innovation in terms of the underlying technologies that enable those products and services, and innovations in how we work. And so if we want to make a productive and successful economy, we need to build productivity growth. Where does productivity growth come from? It comes from predominantly the private sector. Companies that are engaging in acts of innovation and through a process of change, which of course goes way back in time to Charles Darwin, who wrote The Origin of Species. He was, of course, talking about human evolution and evolution of animals. But this notion that the survival of the fittest is the mechanism by which change happens, it applies equally well in the corporate world. The companies that are fit for the future are the ones that survive. How do you make yourself fit for the future? By staying relevant to your customers, by evolving. And at a sort of slightly more narrow way of looking at the same point, is this notion created or defined by Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, of creative destruction. Creative destruction is how society progresses. New companies are created, digital companies for the most part today. Old companies are destroyed in their wake. Creative destruction is what allows societies to progress. So innovation really is the underlying engine through which society moves forward. And in my brief talk today, I am going to share 3 key principles which I believe are central to any conversation about innovation. And the speakers who are coming after me will be exploring some of these in a great deal more depth. Principle number 1, innovation is not just new products. You see on this slide here, I took this slide from a British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, and they were doing an analysis of the 100 most important innovations of the last 100 years, or probably even longer, in fact, if the first one is the wheel. If you look at that list, I mean, I don't think we need to evaluate this list. It's quite an interesting list of innovations. You will recognize most of them. The fascinating thing about that list to me is if you say, what is in common? What have these innovations got in common? They are almost all consumer innovations, things that you and I use in our day-to-day lives to make our lives easier or more enjoyable or more comfortable. They are product innovations for the most part, literally physical things that we can hold. A small number of them are what we might call service innovations. For example, email is a service innovation. It has no tangible form. Now that's interesting. It's useful to know that these innovations have helped us live better lives. But actually that misses the point. And the point I want to get across is that if we're to take a proper look at innovation and the opportunities for innovation, we must not stop at product innovation. Product innovation matters. Product innovation is underlain by innovations in technologies, innovations in processes. When I say process innovation, I mean, for example, Six Sigma or quality management tools that allow us to manage our factories and our logistics systems quicker. But there's much more to innovation than that. And I'm just going to talk briefly about the 2 at the top of this list. Because for me, business model innovation at the top, as typified by a company like IKEA, the furniture manufacturer, and management innovation, as typified by a company such as Google, ultimately for me, these types of innovations are what I call higher order innovations. In other words, they're the types of innovations that, if you get them right, actually make a fundamental difference to success and ultimately to economic progress. Let me talk for a minute about each of those. Business model innovation. Your business model is your formula for making money. Business model innovation is a way of making money that is different to what has gone before. So you all know that Uber, for example, is a taxi company that doesn't own any taxis. Airbnb is a hotel company that doesn't own any hotels, and so forth. These are innovations in the basic choices companies make in terms of how to create value for society. And many of these things have been seen over the last 20 years, thanks to the internet revolution. There's no question that the internet is the ultimate change in technology which made most of these things possible. But there's also a difference in philosophy underway here, which I just want to acknowledge briefly. There's a famous old investor, Warren Buffett, from the US, and he is one of the richest people on this planet. His company, Berkshire Hathaway, is number 9 on the original list I showed you. If you look at the companies he's invested in over the years, it's a lot of, you might call, traditional companies. There's lots of banks, there's lots of companies making consumer goods, and so forth. And then you take Masa Son, the Japanese investor, again, a legend in his own lifetime behind SoftBank, which is a company, many of you will know this, which had, among other things, $100 billion vision fund with funding from many, many places, including Saudi Arabia. And you look at the types of companies that SoftBank has been investing in, and you see a very, very different list. Now, I will be the first to acknowledge that not all of the companies on the right are successful. We all know what happened to WeWork, which has had all sorts of challenges. But the point I'm trying to make is very, very simple, which is we used to believe that value was created in assets. Companies that had lots of assets on their balance sheet were the ones which were successful. And there's a completely valid point of view. There's absolutely value in assets. But SoftBank, if you look at the types of companies they've been investing in and the types of things they're trying to achieve, they are building ecosystems. They are trying to build partnerships, networks. They're trying to change the ways in which people conduct their lives. And they have this fundamental belief that if you create networks and relationships and partnerships, there is inherent value in those as well. And that is, as I say, a different point of view. Both of these things are correct. I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong. But by thinking in terms of networks rather than assets, it opens your mind to all sorts of things that you can do differently in terms of your business model. Let me talk briefly about the other type of innovation, management innovation. And management innovation may not be a topic that you've ever thought about before, but let me just give you a couple of examples of management innovations. If you go historically, look at the original assembly line created by Ford, original changes in how we structure our organizations. All of these changes helped to drive the productivity growth of the industrial period. And then you look at the last 10 or 20 years, you see a whole bunch of new management innovations, innovations in how we develop software using so-called open source, how we do work within teams using so-called agile methods, today's hybrid working experiments. Many companies, and I've just listed a few here, I won't talk about them today, are actively trying out new ways of working in order to build advantage. And if you want just one piece of data on the point that management innovation helps to drive productivity and ultimately advantage, this chart is trying to get that point across. The vertical axis here, the vertical axis is essentially productivity growth. And what this chart says is that if you invest in information technology in your company, you put money into your IT systems, you don't get a productivity payoff unless you also change how you do the work. You have to actually invest in innovative work practices such as agile methodologies in order to get a payoff. My second principle is the principle that elephants can dance. Let me be very clear what I'm saying here. There is a narrative out there, if you read the news press, the business press today, which is that old traditional established companies are dinosaurs, that they are being driven to extinction by the digital startups, the unicorn companies that are growing rapidly on the back of the digital economy. Now, there is some truth to that narrative because, as I said right at the outset, the biggest companies in the world today are all digital companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon. But there is an alternative narrative as well, which is that elephants can dance. In other words, that big established companies can adapt and themselves be agile. Now, that is both a reassuring statement because in some ways, many of you who work for established companies would like to believe it. But it's actually true as well. Let me just give you one piece of data to exemplify this point. If you take the Fortune 500, the big American companies, the 500 biggest American companies by revenue, and you look at that list, and you say to yourself, how many of those companies are new? How many did not exist at all 25 years ago? 25 years ago takes us to the beginning of the internet revolution. Well, when I ask my students this question, Most of them say, well, maybe 100, maybe 200, maybe 300. The answer is 17. Only 17 of the Fortune 500 companies are actually genuinely new companies like Tesla, like Facebook, like Google. And you can see on the chart on the right that actually all of the others are either mainstays, companies that have been around forever, or some spin-outs of existing companies, or sometimes companies that have gradually grown to become large. My point is, there is huge inertia in the Fortune 500, and indeed many of those companies, the big established companies who've been around a long time, are actually remarkably adept at transforming themselves. So there's a lot of myths that we need to get away from. One myth is that every industry is being disrupted by technology. Really only a few industries like media, like telecoms, like digital, like retail are actually being disrupted. It's a myth that disruption happens quickly, and it turns out that actually, with one or two exceptions, such as Nokia and Blockbuster, companies which went bankrupt in a space of 4 or 5 years, it's actually a remarkably slow process. Disruption usually takes 10 or 20 years to happen. And the third myth is that established firms, as I say, are struggling to adapt. And they're not. Established firms, some of them, yes, 1 or 2 of them have gone bankrupt. The vast majority are actually making a lot of changes in terms of their internal ways of working, in terms of the products and services they sell. They are buying up startup companies quite often. They are re-engineering their activities. They are themselves adapting. So that is good news, and it is really kind of informing the last part of my talk. And indeed, if I just give you a couple more data points just to kind of reinforce this, as I've been doing my own research in this area, I look at companies that have successfully transformed. You see a list of 7 of them up on this chart here. These are companies which have been around for a long time, and yet they are every bit as agile and innovative as any other. In fact, just to exemplify this point even further, you take the top 50 companies in the world in terms of their innovation outputs. This is according to the consulting company BCG. You look at that list, of course you've got Apple and Google, Alphabet and Amazon on that list, but you've got a huge number of established companies. The ones in yellow are, in my way of thinking, established companies, big established companies which are reinventing themselves as we speak. So that is good news, and of course it still begs the question, how on earth should established companies actually enable themselves, achieve this difficult art of being an elephant, being very large, and also dancing, also being agile? And the answer is that we have to take a point of view on innovation that is open-minded, that is deliberately involving of everybody across the company. And indeed, the next 2 speakers will both have lots of additional thoughts on how this can be done. Let me offer a few thoughts to get us started before I then hand over to them. The first point, as I say, is that we can have a philosophy of innovation in which we put our faith in the genius, the innovator at the top. Everybody now knows the story of Steve Jobs' multiple innovations in Apple. Perhaps less well known is this gentleman below, Alan Zhang, who I had the pleasure to meet a couple of years ago. He is the founder of WeChat. And if you've ever traveled in China or indeed to the Chinese-speaking parts of the world, you will know all about WeChat. It is like Facebook, but even more so. You can live your entire life on WeChat. In both cases, these guys are the geniuses, the people who everybody deferred to or defers to. They absolutely set the agenda from the top, and everybody follows in their wake. There's nothing wrong with that strategy if your founder is genuinely a genius. And the trouble is that there are not that many geniuses out there. And so for me, the model that says we are going to build innovation through the organization, through enabling and empowering and inspiring thousands of people is the much more sustainable model. We're going to hear a lot about Google in the next hour or so. I'll just also acknowledge a little gaming company in Seattle called Valve. Valve has about 500 employees. It has no managers. It has deliberately taken to extremes the idea that everybody is in charge of helping the innovation process and finding their own ways in which they can contribute. A brief metaphor, if that's helpful. I think in terms of traffic systems around the world. As I travel around to different countries, I'm fascinated by how they manage traffic. And of course, on the left, you see India, chaos, but actually quite a functional chaos in many cases. People find their way through. And then on the right-hand side, of course, you see the traffic cop. You see the equivalent of the traffic lights. You see the ordered system where you do what you are told. And I think traffic system design actually is a really nice metaphor for how we organize our companies. And indeed, just to finish the traffic system story, there was a famous Dutchman from Holland called Hans Monderman. There you see him. He had the idea of taking the chaotic traffic system of India and bringing it to Europe. And he created this model, he called it shared space, where you get rid of all the traffic lights and you simply allow people to figure out for themselves what to do. And it worked beautifully. There's a much longer story here, but the bottom line is you take away the rules and the processes and the procedures, and people figure out a way of making things work. And as I say, I think that's actually a great metaphor for what happens in the organizational world. Because many of us start with a view of organizing and coordinating, which is fundamentally bureaucratic. It's all about governance through rules and procedures. And we know that there are limits to that. And so we gradually build into another model, which is sometimes called a meritocracy, where we want to tap into the knowledge and expertise of the people in the company. Because obviously knowledge and expertise is the driver, one of the drivers of innovation. And that is itself not quite enough, because ultimately meritocracies do not move very quickly. Therefore, we need to move, I would argue, towards a third model. I call that the ad hocracy. The ad hocracy is an organizing model in which we are privileging action. We are getting things done by trying things out. Experimentation and iteration, these are the drivers of innovation in companies. And there are many manifestations of ad hocracy, separate units off to one side, scrums and agile teams as a way of which we empower people to make their own choices. I have one final thing to suggest, which is going to take me about 90 seconds. It is a story of high jumping. And it's a story about how the men's high jump world record was gradually changed over 100 years from being a height of 1.95 meters to a height of almost 2.5 meters. You can see in this chart that there was a spectacular growth in the high jump world record in the 60s. Now, a lot of people assume that was because of a change in the jumping style. Actually, it wasn't. The story is a little bit more interesting, perhaps, than that. The explosion in the height of the bar was a function of a competitive rivalry between two jumpers, Thomas and Brumel, an American and a Russian. They had a competitive rivalry which enabled them to essentially get even better than they were before. Whilst that was going on, there was a gentleman by the name of Dick Fosbury trying out this new style of jumping. He called it the Fosbury flop. And he was experimenting with this new way of jumping. The key point of this story is actually that he wasn't that good, in fact. He was trying this new way of jumping for many years in the shadow of the world record holders. You see on that chart, the green dots are his personal best heights. And it was only when the Mexico City Olympics in 1968 happened and the world champion had broken his leg and didn't participate that Dick Fosbury became famous, because he was the only person jumping over the bar with this unusual style of jumping. He won the gold medal, and after that, everybody else started to try out his new style of jumping. And you can see in the years that followed, gradually, the green dots, the new style of jumping, became the dominant way of jumping over the bar. So the punchline to this story is the following. We can look at the evolution of the different styles of jumping over a 100-year period, and we can see that the Fosbury flop ended up becoming dominant because it was better. It was innovation in how we jump. But it didn't just happen because of an underlying change in technology. It happened because one guy, Dick Fosbury, took it upon himself to break the rules, to challenge the system, and to think the unthinkable. By trying a different way of jumping, he changed the way that everybody jumped forevermore. And he took a lot of personal risk doing so. And for me, this is the heart of our whole innovation story, because it is about individuals having the guts, having the vision to challenge the rules. And in that, I think he's quite like Elon Musk, who is everybody's favorite champion of what I think of as unreasonable thinking. So I will close there. Hopefully some inspiring and interesting observations about how we do innovation. My bottom line is, if we want innovation, we all have to learn to be a little bit more unreasonable, but in a way that also helps our organizations. With that, I will close. Thank you very much.